Level One Coach Podcast. We are back. This week we are going to start our conversation, at least, on the idea of what's called awareness clues. And I first learned about it from Fergus Connolly. I went back through some notes that I took, him and Cody Royal, if you're familiar, the audience is familiar with those two guys. They did some Zoom chats when everything kind of got shut down in 2020 and everyone was sitting around. And one of the days they talked about this concept of awareness clues as part of like a bigger chat on like coach performance, coach health, coach sustainability, that bucket. And they didn't really give a definition. They gave some examples. So the definition that I came up with is basically these awareness clues are signs that you see downstream that upstream there might be trouble. And the trouble is sometimes these fall under the level of our awareness. So I'll give you two examples that Fergus gave, and then I'll give you a personal example. And then we'll kick it over to Mikhail and we'll get going on this. So just for frame of reference, to give you some examples on what this might look like based on the definition. If your apartment gets dirty, is that a clue that you're working too much? That was the first one. And then, are your players talking to you? Are they coming into the office less? And before I give my personal example, something we were just talking about off air is there has to be this contrast. So if your players don't normally come in and talk to you, and then they're not coming in and talking to you, that's not going to be an awareness clue for you. If your apartment is typically messy and your apartment is messy, that's not going to be that like indicator that starts to bubble up to your awareness like, hey, is there something wrong? So the first thing to keep in mind is that contrast. And then my personal example is like when I was coaching the junior team and I was kind of starting to get a little bit fed up with just the losing and some of the stuff that was going on off the ice, some of the trouble that was going on. I started to skip workouts. So like mine would be, I just skipped 2 workouts. What does that say about my mental state? So that would be a personal example from me. I'll kick it over to you if you have a personal one, or we talked about how this is also something we can clue into on the staff level and also the organization level.
Yeah. I think one to reiterate what you said on a personal level, it does matter what like your baseline is or what your relative normal level of comparison is. So if, like you said, if you're, if you're someone who doesn't often work out, then not working out wouldn't be a good clue. For me, I think like one that came to mind as you were talking that I hadn't really thought of before is like, usually like I try to designate times of the day, whether it's in the morning or at night, or we've talked about like going in the sauna, like where you don't have your phone on you, or you're not like listening, whether it's maybe you're in the car, you're not listening to something, you're not actively like doing anything. And I find that when I'm stressed out or when I'm like nervous or anxious, I have a hard time putting away all those like inputs. So one would be like if I get up in the morning and I go walk and I'm like texting the whole time, or I'm going in the sauna and I bring my phone with me, like probably anxious or not able to like just relax, because usually that's something that I can do without needing to look at anything. And now that I think about this, like that usually occurs on like Saturday mornings, usually honestly just Saturday mornings, or mostly on Saturday mornings, because like we played Friday night and now it's like it's a quick turnaround, and that's generally when I feel like I'm at my most stressed or most like anxious, and I don't feel like I can just put the phone away, or I can just like not think about anything related to later in that day, even though like in reality, like do you have 20 minutes to walk without any input, or do you have whatever 25-30 minutes to sit in the sauna and not have any inputs? Like you do for sure, but it feels like you don't. And So I think that's an awareness clue for me that I definitely didn't realize 10 minutes ago before we started. But just like if you catch yourself doing something different than what is your normal, you want to key in on like, okay, what's really going on here? Because there's probably something beneath the surface that you honestly might not be aware of, and might not even realize how stressed you are until you recognize like, hey, this is abnormal for me.
Yeah, the other one I thought of while you were talking, that's like, I think it was something that I defaulted to, and I might have talked about this on an earlier episode, but like, it was essentially like a form of procrastination where when things weren't going well for me coaching, I was like reading a lot, and like I read a decent amount, just like different inputs, helps with my writing, getting different perspectives. Like every coach to a man, like has the badge that they read shit. And like so I read shit. But like it was almost like compulsive and like out of the ordinary amount of reading that I was doing. And it was just like putting off either what needed to be done, or I couldn't like sit with myself, like you were saying, with like the sauna or whatever. Like I couldn't relax and just be with myself. So I needed another input, some people do it with podcasts, some people do it with, I did it with books when I was coaching. But I think just like if you're really procrastinating doing whatever other than the thing that you should be doing, like what is that telling you about your mental state? What is, kind of the awareness clue there that's like beating you over the head that you should kind of check in on? So that was another one.
Yeah, I think it's hard sometimes to recognize those because like you get so wrapped up in whatever it is that you're doing in that moment, or in that, it's not a moment, it can be days or weeks at a time, but you get wrapped up in that and you start only thinking about those things. And probably another one for me that just hearing you say that is like the inability to talk about or think about anything else other than whatever that is, like if it's a game or a practice or a recruiting or whatever. Like if I find myself only talking about that to family, friends, girlfriend, then like it's probably taking over a little bit, and becoming more stressful than it needs to be. And that's something that's hard to recognize. Like, is this really worth stressing out to this extent over? And maybe stressing out isn't always the right word, but if it's occupying that much mental real estate that you can't talk about other things, or you're listening to someone talk about something, you're listening to a completely different conversation with your friends or girlfriend, parents, and they're talking about something totally unrelated, and all you can think about is this same thing that pertains to whatever, coaching hockey, like that's not good. You got to be able to like click out, check out, not think about it for a little bit. It's not going anywhere. And that, it doesn't mean like checking out for a full 2 weeks is a good idea, but like if you can't come home or have a break in your day and not be focused on it for the entirety of that time span, like it's at that point it's not productive. And I think of like, we've talked about this before, but like a lot of times like those breakthrough moments or those ideas that come through to you, they're during times where you're not actively thinking about something, when you're showering or walking or whatever. So if you're constantly focusing on this one thing and thinking about this one thing all the time, every day, you're probably not going to have the best, not even that there may not be a solution that you need to find, but you just may not have the best thoughts and the best, like the best ability to tackle whatever it is, just because you're always thinking about it.
Yeah, that's actually, as you were talking, like I was fucking over here giggling because like that, I didn't think about that, but that was one that actually like resonated really hard with me because I was also doing that. And whether it's like through all the trauma I suppressed it or whatever, but you brought that back out. But like I remember like we had like a fall wedding during the season, and like we didn't have games, and we went out of town back to, she lives in Wisconsin, and we went back to Wisconsin for something. And like you were saying, every conversation, we were supposed to be here at this wedding celebrating these two people, or like at coffee in the morning, hanging out with each other, and like she would say something unrelated to hockey, and I would always find a way to like, oh, that like bring it back to this. Like that reminds me of this player that's dealing with this, and I was just like, looking back, I was like, wow, like I have a shit ton of room to grow here. But like in the moment, that's all that like you live it and breathe it, and you think that's like, I don't even know if you think that's what you're supposed to be doing, but you're just so like deluded that you can't even separate. Like I should be here right now where my feet are, and like I am not. So yeah, that was definitely, as you were talking, something that really clicked with me too.
Yeah, it's hard to notice because like it does matter to you and it is important. And so I think there's a balance. Like I think you can be doing other things, like your example be at a wedding, and still be thinking about what's going on in your other, like the other realms of your life, the hockey or the coaching aspects. Like I think it's fine to be thinking about those things and excited or even like nervous. Like that's okay. But where it consumes everything that you think about or everything that you talk about, and when you get onto a, like you said, you're talking about a totally unrelated topic and then you somehow bring it back to that, it's like now like you're getting into that negative territory where like you don't need to bring it back to this, and it's okay to take a break from it, um, because ultimately like breaks are meant to be a break, like whether it's a wedding or just a Sunday where you're not doing something related to hockey, or like those, and you hear like professional athletes and professional coaches say this all the time, like I take time off at X point in the year because it allows me to be my best later on, or the break I give my body allows me to not get injured during the season, like whatever that is. Like I think in coaching, it can be a really hard thing to do because theoretically, like I'm not going to injure my legs by watching more film, or I'm not going to like injure my brain even by continuing to think about our forecheck. But, and I feel like I've brought up this example before, but there was one year, we had the week of Thanksgiving off. It was one of my years at Curry, and we had Thanksgiving week off, and I pretty much spent the whole week at home at my parents' house, like making calls with recruiting and like just looking at different schedules and watching some film on, it was all like recruiting based because we didn't have games that weekend and we weren't playing for another like 10 days. So I didn't feel like there was a lot to do with our actual team. So I just spent this like vast amount of time working on recruiting stuff. And I'm sure it was like good, I guess. I say good and like air quotes, like maybe it was good to like polish up where we were at with our lists, and I don't know, like maybe it was helpful. But I remember coming back the week after Thanksgiving and feeling like I didn't even get a break. Like I didn't do anything that was like all the stuff that you can't do during the year, like as much of, whether that's like spend as much time working out or, for me, like spending time just like watching a show or reading, like those things you don't do a lot of during the year. And I wasn't able to do like any of that over the break because I just spent the whole time looking at different hockey stuff. And I kind of like told myself afterwards, like, I can't do that again in the future. If you get like 3 days off, like take the 3 days off, because then when you come back, you don't get that time to do those other things, read, hang out, watch TV. Like it's not going to come once you get back from break. And, I do think it's a hard thing. I think it's easier when you're playing because you're like, I'm home, I didn't bring my bag, or I don't have the access to a rink or a gym like I usually do, whatever it is. So it's like you're forced to take a break. But I think when you're coaching or when you're working in even like a non-coaching job, just like a business job or a finance job, like it is hard. Like everyone's got laptops and you bring your shit with you everywhere. So you're just like, oh yeah, I can get on and like watch some Instat, or I can get on like whatever. I don't know what people in finance do because I'm just not educated on it, but you can go do that on your computer when you're home. And so like you really don't ever get a break from it. And I don't think it allows you to be at your full potential when you do come back if you're just constantly grinding away, so to speak.
Yeah, as you were just kind of putting a thought train together as you were speaking there, but like as you were telling kind of your personal story about like not taking a break on break, and then just like the forcing function that you were talking about that not bringing your bag home creates, like you can't go skate if there's like if you eliminate your hockey bag, you cannot go skate. So like how can we, and I started thinking of like phone apps and how you can set limits. Like how can we create a forcing function when we're at some of these events or on break where we can force ourselves not to work. And like something that I do right now that I haven't connected to hockey is like when we go out on like a dinner date, I won't even bring my phone. Like she'll bring her phone for GPS in case we're going into the city, and like I'll get us there, but like her phone will stay in the car and my phone is sitting at my house. So like that ensures that I am present with her, and that's like something that I didn't do when I was coaching. But again, like coming for full circle to make this tactical for coaches, like can you set a timer on your phone if you're gonna watch Instat at home, and can you do it for an hour? And like it's the Parkinson's law thing that starts coming in. Like if you don't set a time limit, you're just gonna sit on Instat all day. Like you'll do it for 10 hours, and you'll watch the next 3 teams that you're gonna play after break. You'll do the whole thing. Like we've all been there. But if you set a time limit on your phone and you say, I'm going to watch film for an hour, I'm going to get everything I can on our next opponent or whatever, and that's it. And then I'm going to go hang out in the backyard with everyone and have a drink or whatever you do. So I think that there's like maybe starting to think of forcing functions about how we can better kind of manage that, if you have any ideas or want to pull on that at all.
Yeah, for me, like I'm not really too familiar with that forcing function term, but I see what you're saying with it. To me, it's like a rule is a similar thing. It's like an example is like you could make a rule for yourself that like when you come home, your phone goes on, do not disturb, or when you come home, your computer's closed. Like, whoa. I mean, another example would be like you brought up like the forcing function of leaving your bag wherever, like not bringing it home for break, like leave your computer at work, which is like easier said than done and sometimes not possible, given like it could be unrelated to work things, but you need your computer to do something else. I don't know. So like it's different for everyone. But being able to create like these rules that again, like you can be flexible with them, and like it's not to suggest that like if you know you, for example, if you're like I'm never going to be on my computer past 11, but your team plays a game at 7 o'clock and it ends at 9 and you're on the bus from 10 to midnight, like it's okay to be on you don't have to be like that strict with it, because that's probably a good time to be on your computer. You got a 2-hour bus ride, what else are you going to do? Better to do that than do it at 2 a.m. like go get some rest. We've talked about that before. But I think like being able to set like some rules and boundaries, or like you call them forcing functions, and thinking about like where else could I create these, not for the sake of just being bound by certain constraints, but like having them in place so that you do spend time actually talking to the person you're at dinner with instead of on your phone the whole time, or you do spend time when you come home being present in whatever it is that you're doing instead of sitting on your computer. And it is so easy to not do those things and to passively just watch, like you said, Instat, or passively click through schedules. Like it's really easy to do that kind of stuff, and you have to kind of stop and think to yourself, like, did I really listen to whatever was just being said? Or I mean, another one that's dangerous, but I think a lot of people do, is like you text and drive, and then you think like, did I even notice the landmarks I just went by? Like I just drove 3 miles and I don't even really remember what went by me, because I was driving well enough to just make sure I didn't crash today anyway, but I didn't actually pick up on what was going around me because I was looking at my phone the whole time. Like it's an easy other scenario where like you you think you're doing okay, you think you're doing it fine, but it's not being done to a safe level there, and a level that's really like that should be acceptable.
Yeah. The other thing that comes to my mind as you're talking about that too, like I'll tell players all the time, and it's something that, again, we tell our players one thing and then we don't necessarily practice what we preach. But like I tell players all the time, like you can go in the shooting room and shoot 600 pucks, but if you're not shooting all 600 with intent, like you might be wasting your time. And if we're passively clicking through schedules or we're like the illusion that we're busy, and like if we're doing that sort of stuff and we're just kind of passively looking over stat sheets or whatever, but we're not like all the way in it, we're just consumed by it instead of like in it. It's essentially shooting 600 pucks without a care in the world instead of shooting 600 pucks like every single one is game 7 and it has to go through the back of the net. So that's another thought that kind of popped in my head. Like this whole, it really boils down to like intention and intensity level. And like that can be another awareness clue too. It's like, am I doing what I'm about to do? Or maybe it's even filter question beforehand. Like, am I about to do this at full intensity, or am I just kind of passively doing it? And if I'm doing that, then maybe to just like, let's not do it and experiment with like what that ends up costing me, or maybe it doesn't cost me at all.
Yeah. No, it's they're hard. They're hard questions to ask yourself, because it's you can easily like trick yourself. I think they're like, no, I'm doing well. Like I did hear what you said, or I did pay attention to what was going on. But just like that, I guess I'm thinking of it now, like it's that passive consumption of just like other information that's not really necessary, but it's hard to put away. And it really only gets harder with like the phone and the computer and everything. Like that makes it so easy to access more information all the time, and you sometimes feel like you're getting behind if you don't have it. Um, so they're like, those are tough awareness clues to key into yourself, or key into about yourself, because it's hard to recognize. But the more like, and I think a good way to start would be like, just make a note of things that you normally do, and then try to measure throughout the year, like, were there points were there points in time where I did these more or less often, and was that a result of me being more or less stressed, or um, was there any reason behind it? And it can give you a good idea of like what your baseline is, and then what it looks like when you're maybe struggling, or whatever, anxious, nervous, stressed out, whatever that word might be for you.
Yeah. Little bit. I don't think it's necessarily off topic, but I'm going to go here because I'm interested to hear what you have to say on this. But just with this idea of, and we've talked on previous episodes and we've written an article about it, and we'll link that one. And I'm going to try and find this tweet and link it. I'm not going to waste your time or anyone listening, because I don't have it pulled up right now, but I have the general like idea.
Mm-hmm.
And we talk about, basically we were just talking about like passively thumbing through stuff and like the busyness illusion, that we have to be doing something. And I saw this tweet, and again I'll link it. I forget who it's by, but his name's Adam Davidson, actually, I remember. But anyway, Adam is talking about how one of these other big accounts in like coach development, player development, was talking about like, how can we create players if we're not doing X? And that part doesn't really matter. But he hopped in with like a quote tweet and started just talking about like the semantics of what was being said. And he's like, we're not creating players because creation implies that you have ownership. And like, let's say if you have a business and you own that business. Like, there are people like Alex Hormozy who talk about, I work 16 hours a day on it. Like, I love doing it. It's mine. And like, I have the fuel to do it because I own it. But Adam's point is, we're not creating players. We're essentially gardening. And I think some coaches in like the mainstream have used that term, but gardening is setting an environment for the players or the plants to grow. And you don't go out and garden all day. Like, you can't water your garden for 16 hours. Like, all the shit will die. You can't like till the soil for 16 hours every single day. So like, gardening applies this principle of like, what is required. And I think based on what we're talking about here, that's kind of, I'll leave it open-ended, but I think it's kind of fascinating how we kind of have weaved that in. So I'm interested what you think about like this whole ownership, creating versus gardening analogy.
I haven't heard of that one before. What comes to mind for me is like, it's the way that you approach, it's all relative, the way that you would approach your team, or I guess not your team, but players within your team, is different, just like the way you would approach different plants in a garden. So if you know that like a sunflower needs a cup of water every day, and you know some other flower needs, or some other plant even needs 2 cups of water a day, then you alter what you do. Or maybe one other plant just needs a half a cup of water a week. Like, well, don't give the sunflower a half a cup of water a week because it'll die, but also don't give that other plant a cup of water a day when it only needs half a week. And I think like knowing what your garden needs is obviously important. It's no different than like knowing what your team needs. If your team needs constant feedback, constant conversation, constant opportunity to talk about different things, then you need to provide that for them, because ultimately, like, what's in front of you, that's your garden. And even if you don't think it's necessary, if they do, then that's all that matters. And we've talked about this before with like adapting and being I guess malleable and able to adapt to the environment you're in, and finding yourself like, if you need to tailor your approach to the team you're coaching, like, it's on you to do that. And I think that's similar. What comes to mind for me is similar to this, that like you have to figure out what it is, and it's not easy. Like, you're not going to find out day one what your team needs or what the team that you're working with needs. But once you figure out like what is the best approach for them to learn and for them to grow, then like you got to set that environment. So if you know that your team, like, I'll use film just as the medium for this, but if you know that your team really doesn't gain much from watching film as a full team, don't have full team film weekly, because it's just not going to help. Instead, figure out when your team or different guys on your team can meet throughout the week or even the weekend, and watch with just the forwards, just the D, just the power play group, just a PK group. Maybe it's a unit of 5, whatever it is, and figure out like what the best approach is for them, and then try that, instead of being like, well, full team film is the most time efficient for me as a coach or for us as a team, and we've got to do it. Like, if it's not working, it's not working, and no matter how hard you try, it's not, the guys aren't going to take to that, or the girls, your team isn't going to take to that. And this is a little bit off on a tangent, but I think I'll throw this out there because I think there may be something for you to pick up on it. Like, the book, we're right now reading Extreme Ownership as a Team, the book by Jocko Willink and Leif Babin. And there's a point in there about, I believe it's either decentralized, I think it's decentralized command, with basically just really quickly, not as a leader at the top, you don't have to be the one that gives out all the orders all the time. It's just impossible. So you got to have like subordinates underneath you that can carry out those missions for you. And I think they reference either from the military or another walk of life, but there's research has been done, and like people can only realistically have a good locus of control, a good grasp on the ability to influence 5 or 6 people at a time. So you think about a coach, like even if let's just leave like NHL and like high end Division 1 staffs out of this because they're going to have 6, 7, 8 coaches. But let's talk about like what majority of teams have, anywhere from 2 to 4. 4 is probably high, 2 is standard. Like you got 25 to 30 players. You can't possibly influence every guy all the time, even if you split the team in half. So like you can resign to just like never being able to do that and never being able to accomplish it. Or like you can use your captains, for example, as a medium. And now most teams have somewhere from 2 to 4 captains. So imagine you have 2 coaches, 30 guys. One coach can take 5 or 6, other coach has 5 or 6. One captain has 5 or 6, other captain has 5 or 6. Now you've just essentially touched on every guy in the team, give or take a few. And to me, it's similar to the gardening example, because like if you try to water the garden all day every day, probably not going to get anywhere. Plants aren't going to grow. If you try to influence and control 30 guys all the time as one, probably not going to get anywhere, and you're going to lose control. But if you're able to put other people in positions of power, and you have captains for a reason, if you're able to delegate, and like they call it in the book, decentralized command, if you're able to have decentralized command from the head coach or assistant coaches, just the coaching staff down to the captains, now everyone in this organization, all 30 guys, will feel like they have a piece of this program is theirs, and they are important and they are valued. And whether it's you talking to them as a coach or the coach or the captain's talking to them, they're being led and they're being influenced by someone that they're likely to follow, versus just, hey, one coach, he has to lead and influence every single guy on the team. I mean, it's almost, if the freaking military can't do it, which is probably the pressure cooker best leadership, at least in our country, like consistently putting out really good leaders. I don't know if that's even what I'm trying to say, but like they're known for their excellent leadership tactics. If they are not able to do it and they don't even attempt, I don't think any coach should be. So it's a little different than the gardening example, but to me, I think it segues into a similar topic.
Couple things come to my mind. One of the first things that I put into practice when I was coaching the junior team, I had heard Cody Royal talk about. He has, and I might butcher it slightly, but if I was to say I'm paraphrasing him, he says, you're not the best coach for every player on your team. And so there would be times throughout the season where I wanted to get a message across to a player, but I wasn't that player's favorite coach on staff. So I would ask Todd to send that message if they had a better relationship. And there was more like and respect there between them than there was more like and respect between me and him. Or sometimes I would go to a player that was his buddy. And I was like, hey, are you seeing this? And he's like, yeah. I was like, can you talk to him? Because I knew I wasn't going to win like that one-on-one confrontation, hard conversation from the gap that we had in our relationship. I had to go to someone that had a smaller or no gap in the relationship to try and get that accomplished. So I'm 100% with you on that. And then the other one, I think I wrote about it in the Hockey Think Tank. I'll try and find it. But I don't know if he still uses it now in Vegas, but I'm guessing with the success that he had in Boston, he still does. But this is me speculating. But in Boston, Bruce Cassidy used basically a huge accountability buddy system. So instead of having, like in the book, they talk about unit leaders and like breaking it down into 5 and 6. I tried that with my team. But with Boston, it was 1-to-1. Like, one person had their guy. So, like, Chara walked in the room and, like, his dude was McAvoy, and if Charlie was fucking off for whatever reason, like, that was Z's conversation to have. And they just had a huge 1-to-1 accountability buddy system. So they had, call it 20 guys in a room. I mean, more than that. But they had 10 pairs of 2. And everyone had their guy. And if their guy was fucking off or not up to standard, or however more professional you want to put that than I did, that was just the conversation and responsibility of one person. So I think that's, like, if you can get that, and, like, Boston had, like, a pretty special leadership group at the time with Chara and Bergeron and Krejci and all those guys. But, like, I think if you can get to that, that is pretty good.
Yeah, and a scenario like that, it's like accountability is always talked about in coaching or just in sports in general. Like, honestly, just in life, like we all talk about like taking ownership or being accountable, holding yourself accountable, whatever. And like, there's basically no room for error in a scenario like that where it's 1-to-1. Like, if you have McAvoy and he's not holding himself to the standard that the team has set, well, like it's on McAvoy, but it's really on you to call him out for it. And if McAvoy gets away with it, okay, it's McAvoy's fault. I'm mad at you, Chara, or whoever it is, because you're the one who's supposed to be in charge of this and who's watching for this. And I think like it's also in an extreme ownership book, but it's like you talk about a mission goes wrong and you can blame the guy who maybe made the mistake, but what about the leader at the top? That's really the guy at the end of the day who you're upset with. So if it's, a hockey example is like you tell your captain, hey, actually, I won't give a theoretical. I have a good example of this. We had a team building exercise when I first got the Tufts last year, with an outside company that comes in and works like on a lot of like leadership principles through. Most of them are all military background, and so you do stuff like we did stuff on a weeknight from like 5 to 10 p.m. roughly, and then you go home. It's about 10:30 by the time you leave. So whatever maybe you go to, you didn't eat dinner or anything, so you're going to bed at maybe midnight, and then you're up at 4 a.m. and you're back, and before you leave, everyone is told, all the guys in the team are told, like, bring a backpack. You need to have a notebook, a pencil, not a pen, a pencil, an extra pair of socks, not the ones on your feet, whatever else. And then at 4:45, you need to be in this parking lot where we were meeting, and we'll do a check where everyone checks if you brought everything. So fast forward, we get there, everyone's on time, which is like a good start. You're like, oh, nice. Like no one showed up late. That's good. And one guy the previous day had been assigned like the check leader. Like he was supposed to make sure that's not true. He was in charge. He was not given any instructions. He was just in charge. Make sure everyone is there. That's all he was told. Everyone's there. They go through and check everyone's bag. Dump your bag out. A bottle of water was one of the things. One guy was missing the extra pair of socks. Everyone else brought everything. And the guys who lead this organization, they were like, we're not mad at the one guy who forgot his pair of socks. The guy who's at fault is, and he pointed to the kid who he had assigned as the leader for that day. He was like, there's two things. One, you didn't run a check before we got here. So maybe, I don't know when this kid showed up who forgot the socks, but say this kid showed up at 4:35 and you didn't need to be there till 4:45. Could he have ran home and gotten an extra pair of socks? Maybe. Could everyone have had checked their cars to see if they had an extra pair of socks? Could you have ran to the athletic center and found a pair of socks? Like just something. Was there a solution that you missed out on in those 10 minutes? You didn't even check to see if that was possible. So now everyone's on time, but you're missing shit. And two, the other piece of it was like, yeah, it is his fault in that he didn't bring the socks he needed to bring, but it's your job as a leader to be held accountable. So I'm not mad at him. I'm mad at the leader of this group. And I think that's a really interesting thing that ties into what you're saying with the Bruins, because it's like, I can be mad if I'm Bruce Cassidy. I can be mad at Charlie McAvoy for deviating from like the standard that we have as a team, but I'm mad at Zdeno Chara for allowing that to happen. And only if Chara knows his job is to hold McAvoy accountable can I be mad at Chara. And the other way is like, well, I'm mad at McAvoy for deviating from the standard, and now I as coach have to yell at him, and like I can do that with him maybe because we have that relationship or just because I noticed it. But like undoubtedly, if you're the head coach or assistant coach and you are in charge of watching every single guy, you're gonna at times miss guys or miss things. Unless you have a staff of 4, 5, 6, in which case then you probably can, divvy up the whole team and have only 4 or 5 guys to watch at a time. But if you're Bruce Cassidy, and I don't even know who his assistants were, but if you're Cassidy and let's call it 2 assistants, like you might miss some guys between a pregame skate, a workout, whatever. Like you just might miss things. But if you have a buddy system like that in place, you're going to eliminate the possibility to miss things. And now, if you notice McAvoy doing that, again, you can hold Chara accountable for it. And to me, it makes a much more efficient. It makes for a much more efficient accountability process and a better culture, because also now McAvoy knows Chara's on me because that's his job. Whereas if coach is on me, I'm like, why is coach down my neck? Like he's always on my ass. You can get personal with it. If you know that Chara's assigned to watch you and he just comes over and talks to you because that's his job, all right, I'm cool with Chara. I should be cool with Chara getting on me because I know he's doing what he's been asked to do. It's not personal.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Like, I think Brian Kite talks about like the idea of 20 square feet, and like it's kind of similar to that. And like one thing he's big on is like his systems of implementation being simple, because simple gives you speed. So when the check can be, okay, like Charlie's under the standard here, let's look to Z to see if he can course correct and like make a productive have a productive conversation or a productive intervention here. Like you go from looking at one person to looking at someone else, and then as the coach, if you're catching that, like you can see 1, 2, and then it becomes on me as the coach to then step in there. But if you're giving ownership to the players, and I mean, I think I'd have to go back to it, but I think it's Mark Bennett talks about the rule of 3 almost to a T. Like you have responsibility over self, and then you have that accountability buddy. He's 2, and then 3 is the coach. So like, it's the same situation. I'm looking at Charlie up to the standard or not. If he's not, then it goes to 2. Is 2 going to say something to 1? Okay, he didn't. I'm 3. I say something. And if your system is that simple, that gives you the speed to be able to implement and have more successful interventions. So that kind of ties a couple people's teaching together. But yeah, if you got thoughts on that at all.
Yeah, I like the simple aspect of it is important, right? Like if you've got this complicated checking process, then it's hard in the moment. Like these scenarios that we're talking about, realistically, they're happening very quickly. Like it's a rep of a drill that you notice is below your team standard, or it's a shift in a game. So if you have like this, well, Chara's got to talk to Cassidy and make sure he's okay with it, and then Cassidy's got to approve of it, and then I can go talk to McAvoy. Like, we're not doing that in the middle of a practice. We're definitely not doing that in the middle of a game on a bench. It's not even beneficial for Cassidy to be worrying about that as a coach at that point in the game. So you got to have simple processes, simple checks in place. The simpler it can be, the easier you can, obviously the easier, the simpler it can be, the faster you can get it done. And that will eliminate the ability for these problems to fester and grow. And I think like any scenarios where you can, or any opportunities you have to input these or to put in place these simple sort of checks like that, ultimately like you're going to have, I think, better return on them, because you're going to have you're going to be able to identify problems quicker. You're going to be able to solve problems quicker. And like I said, things aren't going to be able to grow into these bigger issues because you've neglected them for weeks at a time. Trying to identify it. And it's not a hockey example, but like think of how complicated the process is, no matter what state you're in, of like going to the DMV for like a license or a new what's it called, a new license plate. Like you got to wait in line. You got to make sure you have 17 papers on file. Oh, you didn't bring one, then you got to come back and do this all over again. Like it's not simple, and we all recognize it's not, and we all complain about the same thing. So like don't do that with your own organization. Don't put all these different checks in place that are really complicated, and you need to make sure they all fall in line in order to make it work. Like as simple as it can possibly be is going to, again, allow for you to address the problems quickly and also not allow them to fester and grow into these bigger issues.
Yeah, I think that's huge. The last thing I'll say on that is like part of my growth as a coach, like you get, again, like we talked about almost kind of at the beginning, like we get super excited to do this work, and like we want to be seen as we're doing the work, and like even in quiet moments we're still thinking about the work sometimes. And like when I was starting with my junior team, like got the idea from like Fergus Connolly to put together like a game model and a culture playbook and stuff like that. And I think my culture playbook at the time was like 17 pages of Word document, and like I was like, that's small enough. Like it's a chapter of a book. Like if I ask my players to go over this in training camp and then keep it with them, like no problem. And like I've put that out and open sourced it for people just to see. And then if I'm ever coaching again, I'll publish my new one, but I already have it pared down to like 5 pages. So it's just one of those things where we get like super excited to put all these different systems and stuff in place, and then you try and run it in real life, and you're like, it has to be simpler or we're never going to get where we need to go. So just a personal example.
Yeah, and what you said, it usually does come from a good place. Like you're excited and you want to make sure it's like you put forward the best program or game plan that you possibly can. Like it does, I think anyways, like come from a good place where you're just trying to make sure you don't forget things or you don't leave things unaddressed. But it's hard. It's 17 pages doesn't sound like a lot as a coach. He's like, these are all important. But like, are 17 pages of systems easy to process for a 19, 20, 22, 23-year-old? Like, probably not. That's a lot. It's a lot for anyone to process. And how can you simplify that to make sure that like, what are the 3 things that just absolutely I can't negotiate on? Like I have to make sure we know these things. Let's go deep on those 3 things, because that is going to be simpler for us. And it gets back to what I was saying, like it's going to allow you to address problems quicker when they come up. Because if one of these 3 things are below the standard we want, it's not hard to notice. But if we have 7 things we're watching for, like I might miss one, I might miss 2. And now like, which one do we address? Because we have 3 that we need to address, but we only have 2 days of practice. Like it becomes really difficult. But if you just have like the simpler, and it's not to say that you need fewer, but the simpler and sometimes fewer they are, or there are, then the better ability you have to now address them and make sure that things are to the standard that you want for your team or organization.
100%. We'll leave it there. Share the show, and we will see you on the next one.